And I am going to share my screen. Hopefully the correct one. Okay. And as usual, that means that Zoom just stole my Zoom window, put it somewhere I don't want it. So I can't see anybody. So give me 1 second to arrange this. Okay. So as I said, my name is Marta, and I do have this presentation that hopefully you are seeing the front slide of. But I want to encourage you to interrupt me with questions. You can raise the, reactions hand. You can raise your actual hand, any kind of way you want to get our attention. And one thing I just want to highlight before we start, that one of the reasons why the ministry network is named exactly the way it is, Elder Ministry Network, is that we're not only about how do we minister to elders, but also what is the ministry of elders for us. So today is a little bit more on the former side, but I just want to keep that in mind. There we go. Okay, so there is our exciting title slide. We jump right into bulletins. Oh, right. When you export to PDF, sometimes you lose your bullet points. That happens. So those little boxes, those are bullet points. What we've learned, so I also am in ministry, volunteer ministry at Seabury Life Community, which is a continuing care retirement community. And they have a lot of great groups there. And the low vision group offers guidance on how to make things accessibly readable for people with low vision. And I was surprised. I had been working with the assumption that 14 point was enough. On average, it's not. 16 point. And there's some mixed feelings about whether everything should be bolded, but definitely things for congregational reading should be bolded. If some places will go between regular and italic or other things, but bolded is something that really helps people read. Also, the fonts, the types of fonts that we use, this is all done in Verdana, Helvetica, Arial, and really just the clear sans serif fonts. And I have my one Gaudi word in that line because I do love me some Gaudi so much. But it's funny, when I put it in this slide, I realized that I could tell that's the same font size, it's the same font weight. And the word Gaudi is actually harder to read. Like, I can read it, but it is harder. And so I get it. Always black text on white paper. I know some churches like their goldenrod and their beige and stuff, but anything that reduces contrast reduces readability. Leaving ample white space, something I have not modeled on all of these slides very well, but leaving ample white space so it's easier to navigate the page itself. I don't know the real word for these, but we added, after last time on the suggestion of our wonderful group, consider adding those lighted magnifying glasses. I know my mom uses it for embroidery. Lighting magnifying glasses and rubber fingertips, to get them in Staples office supply store. Both of those will help. Well, one will help with reading, and the manual dexterity necessary to turn pages in a bulletin is a whole world of thing. It does require two hands working in concert in a way that most of us don't really think about. And I first encountered this with a resident at Seabury who had a stroke, and one arm does not obey pretty much anything that she asks it to do. And she could not turn the pages of her bulletin. Just, there wasn't a way to do it. And so that's one of the places the rubber fingertips come in there, and we have another place for that on the next page. But still on this page, if your bulletins are typically 8.5 by 11 folded, which I know is a very common bulletin size, you can usually take that PDF that you're printing from, print it onto an 11 by 17 sheet without reformatting it. And so the process of printing it larger will enlarge it. So you don't have to make two bulletins if you have some people with low vision, or you're concerned about the fact that all 11 by 17 bulletins use a lot more paper. We love elders, but we also love trees. We want to love elders and trees. This gives you an opportunity to print a few large format ones along with the smaller ones. Bulletins. The comprehensiveness of bulletins. This gets a little bit into cognitive challenges. really making sure that everything is in the bulletin. I've watched a lot of people, like when you do, even from the opening line, right? Blessed be God, and then the response. I've seen the priest launch into the Collect for Purity, and people are starting to like, am I supposed to be doing something? I don't know what's next. So keeping all the words in there so they can follow along. Um, and then some things that we don't usually spell out, but can help keep lectors in the game longer. Um, we learn, like most of us, really young, how to introduce a reading, or we had a lector training once upon a time, that says today's epistle comes from the first letter of St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 1, beginning at the 8th verse. There comes a point where that little patter is much harder to come up with. I've had a lot of lectors at Seabury just, start reading. And that's fine. We're not mad at them, but giving that signposting that says this is how we move through the service, it enables lectors to keep on in that position much longer. Um, so that's and I used to have in this slide, that a lot of people would love it if the sermon were in there too. Obviously, we're not most of us ever going to do that, but there are definitely people who would appreciate it. Oh, look, there it is.
So
Include all the
another
priest
thing
words.
with that is that you can, if you are the type who writes out your sermon and preaches from it, which I know not all of us do, but if you do, offering that to people after is a really generous and easy thing, because sometimes they only got about a third of what you said due to low hearing or trouble processing. And if you already have a copy, it's not that hard to make more, right? So offering it for later. I know sometimes I do the post-it thing too, so it's not, but if you are the type that has everything out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, yeah, so including all the priest words. The other thing that I learned and just warmed my heart about including all the priest words is at Seabury we have a large number of retired clergy. And one of the ways that retired clergy, when in cognitive challenging times, can sometimes a little bit forget which role they are in the moment. And so I was sitting next to a retired priest as through the entire service, she was quietly reading all the priest parts. And I'm like, that's fine, And she was really like, I think, more present in the service because she had the role that was more familiar to her in front of her. That one of those transitions, as people have to give things up as they age. Being a priest isn't exactly like being, a lawyer, right? Or any other profession. You don't give it up in the same way, especially if you're still involved in the church. And so that enabled her to keep a little bit more tuned in ways that I found incredibly heartwarming. Um, Somebody in the last session added this next bullet point for us because they've actually started scripting and including all of their announcements as well printed in the bulletin. So that because a lot of times that is the moment where people get really lost because people with less sometimes training in public speaking and diction come up and make announcements really quickly and people miss the words. So considering including announcements in the bulletin would also help. It also helps people when they're home if they're not as internet savvy as maybe a younger generation might be, and most of your announcements are in an e-newsletter or on the website. Having them in the bulletin will help some people know about what's going on that wouldn't otherwise. Um, we do recommend including the music in the bulletins. That can be tricky based on the size of hymns sometimes. And one of the things that we often do is cut the bass clef off from the hymns, since most people are going to be singing the melody anyway. Um, that will often help a hymn fit on the page that wouldn't otherwise without much shrinkage. And the downloads from Right Song will let you resize it as much as you want. But one of the things that people run into is a bulletin of wonderful, gracious 16-point text has a hymn with teeny tiny text that they can't follow, or notes that are too small to see.
I wanted to be sure before we jumped that we didn't miss the excellent bullet point that people can get lost when they look away from the bulletin and then go back to it. So part of this spelling everything out and clearly labeling where you are is to give people orientation if they look up and then look back. And that's something that I have noticed a difference in my 40s from my 20s. how fast I can find my place again, and I can only imagine that keeps going.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And one thing we didn't actually put as a bullet point, but is a good practice is when something happens that's away from the bulletin, like announcements, if the announcements are away from the bulletin, doing and our service continues on page 9. Um, that can help a lot of people. Um, and that actually relates to the next slide very well. Label the bulletin really, really big. This is the one place that I have modeled exactly the way we do it at Seabury. That is the font size of the top of the bulletin, because people will forget where they are and why they are there. And being able to read, it is the 24th Sunday after Pentecost, which is November 19th, 2023. That sounds like today. This must be where I am. And then also labeling the signposts in the service really clearly and bigly. Um, largely, yes. Uh, just it helps people orient. And there are always going to be some people whose low vision is so low that they're not going to be able to get the 16-point font. And though this has surprised me, they often still want bulletins and want to be in the right place in the bulletin. There are at least 2 regulars at Seabury who come who I know cannot read the bulletin. It just, we would have the entire bulletin would have to be the size of this title for them to read it. But they both want to have it in their hands and they want to flip the pages at the appropriate time. And it seems from my point of view a small thing, and yet it seems from their point of view a big thing, and that's the point of view that's important. Okay, I think that might be yes. So the interaction of bulletins and lectors. One of the things that, so at Seabury, we don't really have a choice. If we want to have lectors at all, we're going to have to be accommodating to lectors. But one of the things that we had as a suggestion, so you see this is the same Lord's Prayer on each side. The left side is more how we're used to seeing it. And the people who invented that layout were very sensible. It also is actually easier to read because like people get lost when they look away from the bulletin and they look back, people get lost when they get to the end of a line and then have to come back to the beginning of the line. When the end of the line is the end of a semantic unit or the end of a breath unit, any place that you would naturally pause, that helps people not get lost when they get to the beginning of the next line. In part because that was a pause anyway. So if they get a little lost, the people hearing don't get lost because they're like, you have paused at the comma, as is our way. But it also allows them to pick up the sense of the sentence, if that makes sense. We have 2 more slides on this, so hopefully that will come to make more sense. We start with one where this is how we're used to seeing it, and looking at the right-hand side, people, it's easier to get lost. For thine is the kingdom and the power. Oh, there it is. Ending a sentence on ending a line on and is never going to be great. So then I brought the 23rd Psalm. On the left is the way it's printed in the BCP. And once again, it makes it so much easier to tell where you are. You've got spaces in between the stanzas or verses. You've got, we have our Anglican asterisks. And it allows somebody to read through it more easily. We have also noticed that in terms of being able to being a lector through various sorts of particularly cognitive decline, leading the psalm responsively is something that people can hang with a lot longer because they only have to get 2 lines at a time. And then they have a nice break when somebody else reads the 2 lines and then they get 2 more lines. It's a lot easier to have less pressure on oneself when doing the psalm. So that's that example. But then we also do it with readings. This doesn't immediately strike the eye as much different as the psalm does, but it helps people get the meaning of what they're reading when they're reading in real time. And we never have lectors ahead of time because we never know who's going to be there. So the lector only sees their text 5 minutes before they read it. They're not doing a lot of prep work. They don't have the opportunity to. And having the readings formatted this way has been transformative in terms of people's ability to read, to do the readings, people's willingness to do the readings, and also I think the comprehensibility of them when they are doing the readings. So yeah, and also as Erica said, I've noticed that it improves my reading when it's formatted this way, in a way that maybe it would not have when I was 25.
I've
But
absolutely started reformatting the stuff that I read that out loud in this way. It is dramatically easier to process.
yeah,
So, yeah.
and this was I just credit where it's due. This was advice given to me by a retired deacon at Seabury, who has very strong feelings about what gospel proclamation should be formatted like, for reading aloud. And so this was great. We did not think it would be as dramatic as it was. Like it seemed like such a small thing, and it is not. It really changes people's ability to read. And I think, I don't have as much data on this. I think for the people who are not lectors, but have this in front of them as they're listening to someone read, I think this helps them keep the focus on the reading as well. I'm gonna pause for a second, see any questions or thoughts that have come up and things people want to engage, because you're not interrupting me.
Is it possible to get a copy of these slides so that we can share your really good examples?
It is definite that you will get a copy of these slides. Absolutely. And in fact, if you are at in-person spring training or would like to provide your mailing address, you can get a paper copy of these slides, because that is another way that we're trying to model some of what we're talking about. Some people do better with paper. Okay. Oops, Gina, go for it.
Hi, this makes sense. Thank you very much. But I wonder, and I don't want to jump the gun, but are you also going to talk about then uh, the option of using the BCP and the hymnal, and if it's the most hospitable to put everything into the bulletin, then our bulletins are getting really big, and and like you mentioned it briefly, but I just want to have hope we can address that as well, like asking people to use multiple books.
Yeah, at Seabury, that would not be possible. There's just too many people particularly whose manual dexterity is not at the point of holding books. And one week the photocopier had a I don't know, photocopiers, they have feelings and issues, and sometimes they take the day off. And so we had to do one with no bulletin. And I got all of my exercise that day because I did not realize how many people wouldn't be able to find a page. I mean, we can say that the psalm is on page 574, but if we don't have large print BCPs, and even I have some, the large print BCPs are not that large, but just the process of finding a number in a series of pages is proves too difficult. So I ended up, running around the room, flipping people's books open, and then we did another thing, and then I ran around the room again, flipped people's books open. I think the book juggle, it's like a fun thing to get used to if you're a new Episcopalian with all of your faculties. It just feels like an insult to arthritis and other things. And it's true, it does mean that we're using more paper. I would love to see a world in which we had really simple to use tablets that, most dexterity can swipe. However, then you're talking about a zillion-dollar investment in pew technology that might not last 5 years. And so, yeah, the best I could say is buy recycled paper and recycle the paper.
One
I
thing
find
that
it
we
fun.
did is we had for the season a worship book bulletin that was a paper bulletin that had everything that was going to be for that season, the prayers of the people that was going to be used, the various Eucharistic prayer that was going to be used. It included a lot of the music that we were going to be used in the back of it, and then had a 2-page supplement that had the readings and the collect on it, and handed that out with the booklet. to conserve paper. And then we made the announcements between, we're switching to the Sunday supplement for the readings. And then we switched back to the worship booklet that we had as a paper copy for the rest of the service.
That is another innovative way to design it. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with, knowing your particular population. If you have 2 or 3 people who have, trouble with some of these things, maybe printing something just for them, the people maybe one extra for somebody who's coming in off the street. In a place like Seabury, where 80 to 90% of the people in the proverbial pews, their chairs, are not going to be able to do these things. It just makes sense to do it for everyone across the board.
I'm going to
Okay.
be playing around with that this summer because I too want to save paper, and also I'm very on board with the need for this kind of comprehensive, large print, well formatted thing. So we're going to be playing around with printing 10 and then inviting other people and see what happens. I'll report back.
Makes sense. Yeah. I had the bulletin thing come home to me in a just I think I was 45 vision way. At Berkeley, they were trying to conserve paper, and I was leading morning prayer, and they handed me what I was supposed to lead it off of, and it was the first time leading Spanish morning prayer out of the new translation of the Spanish prayer book. And they handed me a thing with 10-point font. 10. And, it was one of those times in my life where I completely support the expressing gratitude instead of apology sometimes. Thank you for being so understanding, as opposed to I'm sorry I'm such a screw up. Boy, when they said thank you for being understanding, I thought, I am not understanding at all in this moment. I am furious, because what it meant I had to do was start morning prayer late, because I had to get to Wi-Fi to download a copy from the internet onto my tablet so I could actually read it. Because it wasn't that I had to strain, it's that I had to have different glasses. So anyway, done with bulletins. On to seating and room arrangement. Obviously, up front, churches with stationary pews are in different situations than churches with movable chairs. And, that's just what's up. So along with those little rubber fingers for turning pages, music stands can hold bulletins for people with compromised dexterity. And most churches that I've been to have a couple of music stands hanging around. That can really, really change people's autonomy in the service. Especially if you think about, if you have movable pews, but you've got the cutout for a wheelchair spot, usually it's just a cutout. And so the next thing to lean on or touch is all the way up in the next pew. A music stand in that spot gives the person using a wheelchair a place to put their bulletin. I suspect also, if you wanted to try the book juggle, the black music stands, the more solid ones, not the wire ones, might just hold the books well enough to do that. So that might be a way to scaffold the book juggle. So here with movable seating questions, by default, when facilities sets up the chapel at Seabury, they just do straight rows, right? Very linear. And we have broken up the ends of the rows so that there's one chair missing every other row, which allows people who are using wheelchairs to sit wherever they want. Previously, there would just be a carve out in one corner of the room to assume that all the wheelchairs would be, better off in one spot. But of course, just because you've begun to use a wheelchair full time doesn't mean you don't have opinions about where you sit. And as we know from fixed pews, Episcopalians often have very clear opinions about where they sit. And so making sure that there are places where different types of mobility devices can be incorporated into the room in various places in the room. Because the person who always wanted to sit on the side still wants to sit on the side. And then also, if you have, again, this is in the existence of movable chairs, removing one chair from the middle of a row allows somebody to bring a rollator, a walker, put it in that empty space where there would be a chair, and then sit in the chair next to it. One of the most terrifying practices that I've seen normalized is normalizing leaving your walker at the door or in the hall so it doesn't get in the way, but then making your way to your seat unassisted in a way that might be really a dangerous thing for you to be doing. Another thing that, and this bullet kind of spans both the pews and the movable. If you have pews or movable chairs, removing a whole row, making a row of emptiness allows a couple of things to happen. One, you get more space for people with rollators to get into that row and sit down comfortably. Two, people who are vision impaired, the little narrow space in between pews or two narrow spaces between chairs, it can get really hard not to trip on either fold down kneelers, kneeling cushions, or the legs of chairs. So having a nice extra wide row that a person with vision impairment knows where it is, and they're going to be able to walk into it more easily. And yeah, there's just a lot of advantages of removing a whole row. And when you have, oh yes, I already did the thing. If you're removing bits of pews to leave room for wheelchairs, paying attention to leaving space at different parts of the room.
Another thing that we found when we did we moved all the chairs and put in movable pews so that we could make different space as needed. But the other thing that doesn't get thought of as much is we made sure we had some chairs as well that had handles. Because
Yes.
a lot of time when people use chairs, they're not chairs that have arm bottom to be able to help with mobility.
Yeah, and certainly any church that is in the process of switching or contemplating switching from pews to chairs with arms allow people to stand up who otherwise would not be able to stand up from a chair. And so, yes, it makes me sad when I see a church that had switched to chairs but doesn't have any chairs with arms. So yes, chairs with arms help people get up and down. I didn't even realize that, by the way. I was at Seabury for about 2 years and didn't notice that every chair that I encountered had armrests. Didn't even register in my mind, but it's true. Okay, communion. Our practice at Seabury is to bring communion to everyone in their seats, regardless of their mobility. Again, that matters with the, what's the percentage of mobility challenges in your context. But note that generous chair spacing or the space between the pews helps that too. And one of the things that I love about a lot of this information is that it helps everyone. Those of you who haven't met me, I'm rather tall. In a lot of churches that I go to, if I try to kneel on a fold down kneeler, my feet punch the kneeler behind me down, bringing it down into the row behind me with a loud clatter. And wider distance between the pews, I could actually have my legs just be the length that my legs are, which is neat. So bringing communion to everyone in their seats. If that's impractical in your context, think about normalizing bringing communion to those who stay seated first. I see it done last a lot. And I think that, I'm just going to say, I think it's better to do it first. And then consider the language in which you do the invitation to communion. We've thought a lot about how different it is to give somebody permission to sit if they can't come forward versus actively encouraging them to adopt whatever posture for communion is going to be most comfortable for them. And to also recognize that that might not be the same one week to another. And here's one of those places where we're both helping people with persistent mobility challenges and, the dude who sprained his ankle last week and who wants to jump up to go up to the front because that's the normal thing for him to do, except maybe this week it's not. So really encouraging people more towards ease and comfort and less towards necessity. What is the accommodation you need is different than how can you be more at ease in this worship service? Because we're not here to get business done. We're here to worship. So some of the language that we thought of, we encourage those who prefer or who are more comfortable remaining seated to do so, and we will bring communion to you. So we try to keep as much of the can't language out of it and as much comfort language into it. Erica's church kind of spontaneously developed a sort of hybrid communion situation because, like a lot of churches, there's stairs up to the communion rail. And so for people who are fine navigating on flat ground, they all come up to the front row and sit down in the front row of pews, which I believe is universal law, is empty in every church all the time, right? So they sit down in the front row, and it means that if you're accompanying somebody with limited mobility, you could stay right there with them. You know, if you're a little kid with your great grandmother, you can stay in the front row. And then because it's everybody in a row in the front row, it still feels a little bit more communion really than it does special circumstancy. Did I cover that right, Erica?
Yeah, and it sort of spontaneously happened where I am, and I was delighted to see it. And I think a more formal adoption of it could really make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Doo-doo-doo. Speaking. So I know not every church has a sound system, but for every church that does have a sound system, everyone who speaks mic'd all the time. For a lot of reasons, partially because a lot of people are not as good projectors as they think they are, partially because amplified voices hit hard difficulty hearing somehow better, clearer. Um, and because some people have Bluetooth integration for their hearing aids that can integrate into certain types of sound systems. Again, that's something we have at Seabury. And I am told for the people who have the Bluetooth hearing aids that when it goes through the Bluetooth system, it's like having the sound piped directly into your brainstem. And so the level of hearing, you know, hard of hearing is a huge spectrum. The correctability of hard of hearing is a huge spectrum. And from what I'm told, the like gold standard of can you hear this is I am mic'd and in a Bluetooth system and you have the Bluetooth hearing aid, you will hear me. Again, also about people getting to sit where they want to sit. It can feel really unfair for a lifetime back rower to suddenly have to go to the first row in order to hear. So that. Um, yes, mic'd, Bluetooth, and then consider not requiring lectors or intercessors to come to the front of the room. Again, that's a thing that we do at Seabury. It's usually me with the microphone dashing across to the different readers so that the readers get to stay still. Again, in a majority elder situation, sure, some people could come up to the front and read, but it sort of can set up a little hierarchy of like people who are fully fledged readers and people who are, you know, maybe backup readers. And I just recently had a experience where a new person who hadn't been there before came, and I asked if she wanted to read, and she said, "Oh, I can't. I use this walker." And what a circumstance that we've created in the world that says you use a walker so you can't read. There are definitely people who can't read for reasons of not being able to read. Using a walker should not be the thing that that takes you out of it. And that's one of these other things about the active invitation. Recognizing that many people will believe that they're now automatically disqualified, right? I can't walk independently, and so therefore I can't be a lector because lectors have to walk to the front of the room. And really paying attention that when people's circumstances change, re-invite them to do the thing that you know they, or you guess they still can do, even if they might need to do it differently than they used to. Because a lot of people will just say, no, I couldn't do it anymore, when they really, really, really want to and really miss it. In fact, the one person I had in mind when I was talking about leading the psalm being a bit easier had selected herself out of lecturing for quite some time because she was having trouble with it. And when we figured out what she needed to do it, she was so grateful. And she's a clergy widow. So I think participating in the service is something for her that has been really, really meaningful. And she's gotten to do it longer than she would have. Thoughts in the room? Okay. Standing. Standing is a whole thing. Our beautiful BCP that we love so much has so much to say about when you should sit and when you should stand. And we have made the choice to omit any standing related rubrics whatsoever from Seabury. Because you'll get like me and Gregory standing up. And it again feels like you're setting up a hierarchy. Like my worship is literally higher up than yours. And so we just encourage, we don't do anything. We just let people sit. A couple of people will stand for the standing parts, because it has been drilled into their DNA. Obviously, we don't tell them to sit down when that happens, but be aware that there are people who had this drilled into their DNA who will instinctively try to stand when they no longer can. And that is a really frequent cause of falls that I have witnessed, is somebody trying to stand because they have momentarily forgotten that they no longer can do that. And so that, yes, not feeling your observance is less than. The other thing is, again, considering language of active invitation that isn't focused on ability. Please rise in body or spirit. To me, carries a really different connotation than standing as you are able. It seems to me, for all of the things that I've ever been not able in, being reminded of my lack of ability has never really put me in a better mood. And again, we're back to some people who are only technically able to stand will push themselves to do so, even when it's not really safe. So actively encouraging, actively inviting people to adopt the best posture for their bodies. And of course, the prayer postures and the rubrics were not developed to be exclusionary. They were developed to enable people to worship together. But as my noble partner added this wonderful sentence, localized context of Anglican worship, it's like what we do, right? Adapting to the local context. And if the local context has trouble standing, sit. And of course, we are in the Episcopal Church, consulting with your bishops or diocesan liturgical committees. That's one of the things that I think they're there for, and they like that. So, we're having this thing. What do you think is a good way through it in terms of standing, sitting, walking? Oh, no, wait, this is a new slide. Somebody mentioned this last time and we made a new slide. Coffee hour is also a place where people should feel welcome. And noisy rooms are terrible for people with hearing impairments. I mean, just terrible. So considering a quiet section or a room off to the side, if there is one. I know the Undercroft at my church in Cambridge had a Sunday school room off the side of it. Just some other place designated for less, what's the word I'm looking for? Mayhem. And note again, so many of these things are good for so many different populations. This is also a great thing for people who have sensory integration difficulties or social anxiety. No one's ever had social anxiety at a crowded coffee hour before, right? No. And then also accessibility of the literal coffee. Is there enough of a coffee hour host that can help somebody get coffee into the cup, get the cup someplace where they can drink it if that is a challenge? We have been growing a program at Seabury that I forget what we've called it, Chapel Friends or Sunday Buddies or something like that, where for each person with significant mobility challenges, a volunteer without significant mobility challenges comes and, either pushes their chair to get them to chapel, etc. And increasingly, they're sitting next to them and just like being the church buddy. So some of those page flipping issues and things like that are getting addressed organically. Coffee hour buddies would also be a great way to make sure everybody is getting to participate. So, got like Jane's coffee hour buddy is Pat, who makes sure Jane's in a good seat and has her coffee and her snack. And Alex's coffee hour buddy is Madison, who knows how to call the senior ride service to get Alex home. And those sorts of things, a lot of people in a lot of congregations want to be more pastoral than they get a chance to be. And this is such a great way to introduce folks into helping. I have this vision of getting the teenagers involved in being the coffee hour buddies. Just saying, if you got teenagers and elders. So that coffee hour. And our other new a sign about signs, a slide about signs. I never figured this out before, but in our last session, somebody pointed out that many of our churches were built for pedestrians arriving on foot. And now we have parking lots that sit in weird geographic locations based on the church. Frequently, what the architecture of the church thinks is the front door is no longer the door most people or anybody is using. So thinking about, does your church have a sign anywhere that says, church here, please enter this door? I almost missed a preaching opportunity once because I was going to a church I'd never been to before. I went to what the architecture clearly told me was the front door, which was locked, and it did not open. And finally, like 5 minutes before the service, I just circumnavigate the church to see if I can find any way in, and found the side door that they now use as their primary door. Would have been really bizarre if the whole church service had gone on without me and they had no sermon because I was sitting on the front steps wondering why no one was at church. So if the accessible entrance is different from the main entrance, this was true in Cambridge, is there signage from the main entrance that tells you how to get there and how to get back? Is the accessible entrance just a ramp? Because sometimes if you go up or down the ramp and get to the end of the ramp, you get to a closed heavy door that from your position in the wheelchair, you cannot open. So those, push the button, automatically open doors can be very helpful.
Or a
And
door host, like someone
a
who's
door
agreed
host, yeah.
to stand there and greet in that way.
Yeah. Is the accessible entrance ushered? If the other
Yeah.
entrances are ushered. And restrooms. Obviously restrooms themselves should be clearly labeled. We know this, but labeling in the narthex or someplace really, really, really upfront where the restrooms are and how to find them. Anxiety about finding a restroom can shift dramatically as bodies change, as bodily requirements change. And it's not always something that anybody wants to talk about. And it's weird. Somehow the low stakes asking where the restroom is an easy question. But when internally you know that this is actually a really high stakes question in this moment, the question gets harder. So labeling restrooms and labeling everything. Just signs are great. Signs and signposting. Okay. And the last slide that I forgot about, the two in the middle. There we go. Above all, ask. It takes a long distance of various sorts of age-related challenges for people not to be able to answer what would make them more comfortable. There is a point where that can happen, but most of the time asking what really feels more comfortable to the person will yield wonderful results. And again, this is that active invitation, encouragement. I almost like encouragement better than invitation, because sometimes you really do have to put a little bit of heart into somebody. Encourage them to ask for what they want for comfort and ease, not what they need for accommodation. Let person-led comfort in worship be the standard rather than adequate accommodation. Centering comfort and ease as part of worship is part of worshiping in a community, and we neither encourage nor recommend nor support, instead a clinical checklist of things that you must do to avoid liability. And so ending here with just some language offerings. How could we offer you more ease in this service? What method of receiving communion is the most comfortable for you? How do you find the volume of the sound system? Do you have to strain at all to hear? And all of these are pointing to, ease, comfort, and lack of strain. Because I think we should strive for more than adequacy, but real integration and welcome. That's what we brought. So questions, thoughts?
Maybe unshare the screen so we can see each
Oh.
other a little.
Yes, I can do. People get bigger.
So I did want to speak into the room that we have a lot of traditions in how we do things that are kind of counter to this, right? And you don't have to do all the things or everything all at once. Finding one person and making their worship a little more comfortable is a huge thing. And then finding the next person, and it can be part of growing the community and part of that pastoral care, rather than being like, okay, we can't do the full bulletin, we can't do the big thing, so we're just done, right? Like it doesn't have to be all. It can be slow and it can be intentional and loving, and that's really good.
Yeah. And that slow intentionality also can help with adoption. The person who's too embarrassed to ask for what would really help, seeing that person over there getting the thing that really helped them might empower them to say, actually, I could really use that thing.
Yeah. I've also I've introduced some of these things in a smaller service I do at St. Stephen's that only has about 10 people. And so we have the big bulletin and we have it because it's different than Sunday worship. And a lot of them have been like, this is nice. And I'm like, yeah, this is nice. It's there. If you can find a way to try out some things, maybe not on Sunday morning, that see how it works, see how people respond to it. That could be really helpful.
Sandra, you had something?
I'm just leaning into trying to inflict name tags on my congregation. And they think it's a newcomer thing. I already know everyone, but I'm using as a mode to do that. Yeah, and we have some older members for whom remembering names is hard. And it's a kindness to them.
Yep.
And the reviews are mixed, but we're sticking with it. But it's accessibility to community is
Yeah.
my own dad, stopped attending church because it just got harder to hear people's names and remember.
Yep. And name tag formatting, you reminded me, I had mine on from Seabury. Having the name that is operational, stupid big. Because if it's coffee hour, you don't really care what my last name is. And so if that last name is too small for you to see, that's fine. But stupid big. I knocked on a lady's door at Seabury wearing my name tag one day. Turned out she was the chair of the low vision committee. And she said, that's the best name tag I've ever seen. Never knew I was going to get graded on my name tag, but yeah. That the default name tags that they give out to Seabury residents, I can usually not read unless I'm getting awkwardly close, and nobody wants that. So yes, I agree with you about name tags and also formatting of name tags that make them, legible.
That's also if you had any neurological stuff with COVID, which I did, names is one of the things that doesn't come back quickly. I'm noticing that in myself, and as I've started at new church communities, that I really have trouble getting the name and the face together in a way I never did before COVID. And so, as with all of these things, often when you make it more comfortable for one person, it trickles out to the whole rest of the community. I
Yeah.
would be super grateful for those name tags.
Also, when I started wearing one, I mean, when I came to Seabury, and so I was wearing one all the time, honestly, it made me feel like I was living in a friendlier world than I ever had before. Because there's remembering somebody's name and then there's remembering it in the instant. And so I get a lot more like walking down the hallway. Hi, Marta. Good morning, Marta. Like, oh. And I realize it's just because you can read it right there, but it feels like a friendlier world. And I suspect also, I mean, loneliness being one of the biggest things that our elders do suffer from. Again, I'm thinking about those teenagers, the hypothetical teenagers who have not differentiated between Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Johnson in 20 years that they've been alive. And to be able to have, here, could you go bring Mrs. Smith a cup of tea? Here, Mrs. Smith, here's your cup of tea. Mrs. Smith is happier than she was before. We have just come upon 2:00. Do we have closing thoughts, additional stuff? Naomi, you just popped back on screen. I was wondering if you had a thought.
Nothing specific. I just, I was done passively listening and maybe preparing to have thoughts. I think these are such great ideas. I mean, honestly, I'm not part of the target demographic, and so many of these things would make my life happier and easier, things like name tags and stuff, stuff like that, so I mean, I think some of this could just kind of make church a little better and a little less stressful for everyone, or a larger demographic of people than it's necessarily targeted to.
Agreed. Yes, Gina.
Thank you so much. I have like over 10 ideas in my notes here. This is really, really great. One thing that, two things that I thought of was, one, this past Sunday, the musical director said, we're going back to the Gloria. People aren't, especially at the 8 a.m., which is a older crowd, but we do have 2 little kids there. She said, they're not going to flip to it fast enough. And we haven't been doing it in Lent. So please announce it. So at both services, I announced it at the top. We're going back to the Gloria. Please open your books now to S280 and have it ready, because it comes up pretty quickly in the service. And I thought that was just for Sunday, but I can now see, that could be a helpful reminder. But then I thought, as you were talking about, we, as we play around with our bulletins now, based on this, one thought I had was taking these little, arrow stickies and putting them, if you just got them, and for a season, like if you're doing the Gloria or the Sanctus or whatever, your service music, and you went around in the hymnals and you put these in the hymnals, and then you had a big note, red arrow, or, that might be a way to not print all of the music in the bulletin, keep people still using the hymnal, and making it hospitable and user friendly. So that's one idea I just thought of. The other one I had was around name tags, and I, of course, immediately went to the very few kids or teens that we have and thought, oh, never. They're not going to want to wear a name tag. And then I thought, unless they make their own. If they make their own, they're going to wear it, or they're more likely to wear it. In fact, wouldn't it be cool if you had them make other people's? But again, we need that big font. We need it to be really, really readable. But for the kids, I think that's an idea there.
You could give them a little competition to who makes not the most artistic name tag, but who makes the most legible name tag.
Right.
And like, this one's legible at 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet.
Yeah. And I lastly just want to say, I really, really appreciate the please rise in body or spirit. Wow. That's a very loving.
Yeah. Another phrase we've used is all may rise for the Gloria, for example.
But then I still think that's can feel a little shaming, because,
agreed.
And I said spontaneously on Sunday in my sermon, that it just happened, everybody please stand. And then I saw someone in the front row who was on a walker, who probably shouldn't have been standing up, really trying. I felt so bad. I did apologize to him later, and he said, no. And he did get up, and I knew he wanted to get up. Right. But again, I like the please rise in body or spirit, because then you're taking away that feeling of, I think you're just meeting them where they are and giving them the option. Thank you.
And it makes it very in the moment. Some Sundays I may pop up just fine, and some Sundays I'm like, you know what, today's a spirit rising day. And I've had that of weariness. It's sure. There are many reasons, but it's it's a real kindness, I think.
I think somewhere in there is a sermon that starts with the Sursum Corda and be like, we already know how to do this. In fact, don't we get asked to do this all the time? Okay, well, I think that we're about an hour since we started introductions. I think we can stop the recording.
As this percolates in you, if you have more ideas or try things out, let us know, because we are continually adding to this resource sheet, and every community is a little different. So we would love to see what's working. And Or if there's something else we
Absolutely.
didn't touch on that you'd want to explore more, we would really be delighted.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.